we're just going to suffer, because this will never fulfill us, because when the stimulus finishes, it finishes. It's finished. And so if we start craving this, we get frustrated when we don't get it, we get disappointed when it finishes, and when we have craving, it agitates our mind. So this craving or hoping that this is going to make this, that's the problem. So from a Buddhist perspective, this is fine, no problem. Good. But don't hope that this is going to give you this, because otherwise you're just going to suffer. If we strive for this, then we can benefit others much more than we do now. Because now, if we have this as our goal, and we benefit, we're expecting or hoping to get something. And if we don't get it, we get disappointed, we get frustrated. Whereas in this state, we are just giving, giving, giving for the purpose of giving. So this is the best state to help others.
Yes, I understand. What I mean is, if I will be alone in the world, totally alone, I will not have the possibility for a genuine, because I will not have the possibility to give other people in a genuine way.
So again, here, to develop this is to develop the healthy attitude. For example, in Buddhism, and we're going to look at this a bit later, giving, that activity is defined as the intention to give. So what is key is to develop the healthy attitude, the intention to be generous. That's the key. And then, of course, if an opportunity arises, we be generous. But we can have that intention all the time, whether or not there's an opportunity to give. So the key is the intention.
I have a similar question.
Mm-hmm.
My question is about suffering that is like things like death or sickness. Like if people, I understand the concept of me loving someone and then he dies, so I'm not supposed to be sad because then I'm attached.
No, I didn't say that.
Yeah, but
I'm not saying that. So we're not talking about if there's a tragedy, we sort of have a blank look on our face. That's pathological. That's not healthy.
yeah.
We're not talking about that. You know, because often in Buddhism you hear the word equanimity, and people think, oh, equanimity means some sort of tragedy, we just sit there with a blank look on our face. This is not healthy. Buddhism never talks about that. What we're talking about is not reacting to that in a way that creates more suffering. So if we see something tragic, sadness, fine, good, it's a healthy sign. But often, because that comes in the right side, we don't like that. So when we see something, not only are we sad, but on top of that, we have this, oh, I don't like that, go away. And then what happens is that aversion causes our sadness to degenerate into grief, despair, depression, and anxiety. Is that helpful? Is that helping in any way? All it does is makes us suffer more. But if we can stay in that state of sadness, then we can look at, well, can I do something here to improve the situation? If I can, let's improve it. If not, okay, what to do? Then we won't go into that state of more suffering. So there's a difference between sadness and despair. Sadness is something healthy. It's acknowledging tragedy and suffering. But then that can go one of two ways. Either going in a positive way to say, well, what can I do something about this to improve it or not? Or we can have the aversion to that and going, oh, I don't like that. And all that does is it creates suffering for ourselves. So actually, pure sadness actually is not suffering. The suffering comes when we start to have aversion to that.
When we start not wanting to feel sad.
Well, when we don't like that and we want to push it away, that's when we suffer.
When we don't accept the fact that we're sad.
Yeah, basically, if we resist it is another way. Resistance instead of acceptance, yes. That's when we suffer.
When we don't accept the things.
Yeah.
If it's
But
there's
it-
other situations
But
that's happened.
what we have to be careful about, acceptance doesn't mean resignation. Acceptance doesn't mean I won't try and do anything. That's not acceptance. Acceptance means in the moment, I'm experiencing this. I can either accept this fact or I can try and push it away. That's resistance or aversion. So the opposite of that is acceptance. So yes, if you see some tragic situation and you're sad, acceptance means acknowledging, yes, I'm sad because there's tragedy. Okay, can I do something about this? If so, let's try and improve it. And then it's okay.
Why sadness is not suffering?
Because we are, it's more coming later, and maybe we'll leave it till then, it'll become more clear, hopefully. But it's not the sadness that, see, for us, of course, sadness means suffering. Because whenever we're sad, we instantly have this, oh, I don't like that. The aversion. So for us, sadness is always mixed with aversion or resistance. It's the aversion or resistance that causes suffering. But we don't notice, we just think there's one thing going on, sadness, and I'm suffering. But actually there's two things going on. There's sadness and aversion mixed together. It's the aversion that's causing the suffering.
But isn't sadness is the opposite of happiness?
No.
No.
No. No. So again, and this is going to become hopefully more clear later, is, you know, in that we had the pleasure, pain. Pain. We say pain, we normally equate pleasure with happiness, but we normally equate pain with suffering. Is pain suffering? No. Pain is just a certain experience. Certain, like if we have it in the body, it's a certain type of sensation.
But it's not a good type of sensation. It's painful.
But painful is just a label we're applying. Is that painful situation? Is that pain actually suffering?
Yeah.
We think it is. We think it is because pain always comes with aversion. Because pain is pain. Oh, I don't like that. Go away. It's the aversion that creates the suffering.
So what's the suffering is the fact that we reject it, not the fact that it's there.
Correct. The suffering comes from aversion. And from a Buddhist perspective, there's something going on at a little bit deeper level, which we're going to look at later. But I don't want to bring it in here now because I have to present some other things. So there's one more thing to add to that, but I want to keep that till later. At something that we, at a deeper level, what's precipitating the whole thing. But that's coming later. I don't want to mention that now because it'll just be confusing. Okay. So then, what we're talking about here is to strive for this state of genuine happiness. A state of happiness, a state of well-being that is not stimulus-based. Does not require any particular stimulus to be there for us to be in that state. So, therefore, to overcome suffering and to strive for this genuine happiness, we need to know what's the cause of suffering and what's the cause of happiness. And so this is the very first thing the Buddha taught when he achieved enlightenment, the Four Noble Truths, is suffering and its causes, happiness and its causes. And so that's what we're going to be looking at shortly. Before we do that, I'd like to just do a short summary of the history of Buddhism so we can see how the whole Buddhism began and spread. So it all began in 563 BC, so more than 2,500 years ago, in a place now called Lumbini, which is in modern-day Nepal, in southern Nepal, just north of the border with India. And there a prince was born, Prince Siddhartha. The father was a king. He was the king of the whole region. And the king received a prophecy from the local wise person in the court who said that this boy, prophesied that this boy would either become a great king or a great spiritual leader. And so, of course, the king wanted his son to follow in his footsteps, so he brought him up in the palace and trained him in a way to become the next king. So he surrounded him with a lot of pleasures and luxurious lifestyle and so forth. But then as the prince was growing up, he occasionally went outside the palace and he saw the harsh realities of life. He saw aging, sickness, death. And he also, on one occasion, saw a wandering holy person who seemed to be very much content with their life. And this got the prince thinking about life and the meaning of life and suffering and if we could overcome it. So he decided he needed to find out about these things. So he escaped from the palace at age 29. And he went out in search of the truth. And he found, and of course at that time there were already a lot of spiritual people following spiritual path. And he found some teachers. And a lot of those traditions felt that it was craving and attachment that really creates suffering, particularly craving and attachment for the body. So as part of the spiritual practices was ascetic practices, basically denying the body, meaning fasting, extreme fasting, to somehow transcend the body. That was the idea. And so Prince Siddhartha, and as part of that, to develop deep absorptions. It was felt that if you develop high levels of concentration and absorption, you can go beyond all craving. So that was the main practice. So Prince Siddhartha spent 6 years doing ascetic practices, developing high levels of concentration and absorption. And then after 6 years of doing this sort of practice, Prince Siddhartha was on the verge of death from malnutrition. And then he understood at one point that this is an extreme, that can't be the path to liberation. That just like previously in his early life in the palace, he was stuck in the extreme of indulgence. Now he had simply gone to the other extreme of a denial, of asceticism. So he gave up his teachers and went out on his own in search of the truth. And what happened next, I'd like to read about that from a book called What Makes You Not a Buddhist by Songsa Khyentse, quite a well-known Buddhist practitioner in Tibetan tradition. He's also made a couple of movies. And he says the following in his book, What Makes You Not a Buddhist. Through many years of contemplation and penance, Siddhartha remained steadfast in his determination to find the root cause of suffering and to ease his own suffering and the suffering of others. He headed to Magadha in the heart of India to continue his meditation. Along the way, he met a grass seller named Satya, who offered him a handful of kusha grass. Siddhartha recognized this as an auspicious sign. In ancient Indian culture, kusha grass was considered a cleansing substance. Instead of continuing his journey, he decided to stop and meditate right there. He found a place to sit on the flat stones under a nearby Ficus religiosa tree, using the kusha grass as a mat. Silently he vowed, "This body may rot, I may disintegrate into the dust, but until I find the answer, I will not rise." As Siddhartha sat in contemplation beneath the tree, he did not go unnoticed. Mara, the king of the demons, heard Siddhartha's vow and sensed the strength of his resolve. Mara grew sleepless, for he knew that within Siddhartha existed the potential to throw his entire domain into chaos. Being a strategic warrior, he sent 5 of his most beautiful daughters to distract and seduce the prince. As the girls set out, they had full confidence in their seductive talents. But as they approached the meditating Siddhartha, their beauty began to vanish. They withered and aged, they grew warts, and a stench rose from their skin. Siddhartha did not stir. The dejected Apsaras returned to their father, who was furious. How dare anyone refuse his daughters? In his rage, Mara summoned his retinue, a great army furnished with every imaginable weapon. Mara's army attacked in full force, but to their dismay, all the arrows, spears, stones and catapults aimed at Siddhartha transformed into a rain of flowers as soon as they came within reach of their target. After many long hours of unsuccessful warfare, Mara and his army were exhausted and defeated. Finally, Mara came to Siddhartha and with all his diplomacy tried to talk him into giving up his quest. Siddhartha said he could not give up after all these lifetimes of trying. Mara asked, "How can we be so sure you have been struggling for so long?" Siddhartha answered, "I don't need validation. The earth is my witness." And with this he touched the ground, the earth shook, and Mara evaporated into thin air. Thus Siddhartha found liberation and became a Buddha. He had discovered the path to end suffering at its very root, not only for himself but for all people. The place of his final battle against Mara is now called Bodh Gaya, and the tree under which he sat is called the Bodhi tree. This is the story that Buddhist mothers have told their children for many generations. So of course, when we look at that story, we can accept it literally and accept that there was this being called Mara who had the daughters and who had an army. But actually, as we're going to see a little bit later today already, these Mara, the daughters and the army, are actually symbolic of inner demons that we need to overcome. And what those three inner demons are, we're going to start to look at this afternoon. So Siddhartha overcame his own inner demons and achieved the state of enlightenment. So enlightenment is the translation of the Sanskrit word bodhi. Hence Bodhi tree. He sat under the enlightenment tree. Now, what is the state of enlightenment? In the state of enlightenment, not only have we eliminated all suffering and its causes, but we have also fully developed all the positive qualities like love and compassion and patience and so forth. And when Prince Siddhartha became enlightened, became a Buddha, he became known as Shakyamuni Buddha. So Buddha literally means fully awakened, awakened one. So a Buddha is someone who's achieved the goal of enlightenment. And Shakyamuni, Shakya is actually the clan or group of people that Prince Siddhartha grew up in. And Muni here has many meanings. Muni here means capacity or strength. The capable one, having a lot of capacity. And here it's talking about capacity to help liberate others from suffering. So Shakyamuni Buddha is the fully awakened one from the Shakya clan who has the capacity to help dispel the sufferings of others. So this is Shakyamuni Buddha. So Prince Siddhartha became enlightened at age 35. He then wandered around India for the next 45 years, teaching people what he had discovered himself. Now, the very first teaching he gave is the Four Noble Truths in a place called Sarnath, very close to Varanasi. And the Four Noble Truths is the foundation of all Buddhist traditions. And so it's the Four Noble Truths that in the next session we're going to introduce and discuss that framework. and then we're going to build on that framework more today before we go into looking at the Lam Rim framework tomorrow. So after the time of the Buddha, Buddhism started to spread to other countries. Now, initially, when Buddhism spread from India, it spread through the Pali language. And first it spread to Sri Lanka, then it spread up through the northeast into Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, across Southeast Asia. So in all of these traditions now, Buddhist traditions, if you go there and they refer back to the original texts, they will refer back to the Pali, the text written in Pali. And all of these traditions collectively now are called the Theravada traditions. Then Buddhism continued to develop in India, and it started to develop more and more through the Sanskrit language. And then, when Buddhism then again started to spread from India, this time it was spreading up through the northwest of India, up through what's now Afghanistan, Pakistan. It went over the Himalayas onto the Silk Route, and then it went across the Silk Route into China, Korea, Japan, and down to Vietnam. And then at a later time again, it went over the Himalayas into Tibet. So all of those Buddhist traditions now, when they go back to the original Buddhist texts, they go back to the ones written in Sanskrit language. And these traditions collectively now are called Mahayana. Now, one of the differences between, and we're going to look at this more detail this afternoon, that in the Theravada traditions, the goal of the spiritual path is our own liberation from suffering, personal liberation. And that goal in Sanskrit is often called nirvana. So what we find in these traditions is that the goal of the spiritual path is the state of nirvana, personal liberation from suffering. Whereas in the Mahayana traditions, the goal of the spiritual path is enlightenment and to become Buddha. Because in that enlightened state, fully awakened state, we're most effective in helping to liberate others from suffering. So in the Mahayana, there's not just this striving for the goal of personal liberation from suffering, but there's a striving for the goal of enlightenment so that we can help to liberate everyone else from suffering as well. There are some other differences, but we'll look at those later. So when Buddhism first came into Tibet around the 8th century, and it came into Tibet in the 8th century through two great Indian masters, Shantarakshita and Padmasambhava. And through their efforts, we have the first school of Tibetan Buddhism being formed. And that's called the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism. Nyingma is a Tibetan word, and it literally means old school, the original school, the first school to be formed in Tibet. And the system of practice, or the framework of practice that Padmasambhava introduced into Tibet is now commonly referred to as Dzogchen. Dzogchen is also a Tibetan word. The original Sanskrit word is Mahasandhi, but usually you'll see the Tibetan word. And Dzogchen often is translated as great perfection. So this is the framework that in the Nyingma school that they follow in the spiritual path. After this time, a king came to power in Tibet who really didn't like Buddhism and tried to wipe out Buddhism in Tibet. And so for a couple of centuries, Buddhism sort of went underground in Tibet. Then around the 10th, 11th century, another wave of great Indian masters came over the Himalayas into Tibet to reinvigorate, re-establish Buddhism in Tibet. And as a result of these various masters, we have slowly the other three schools of Tibetan Buddhism being formed. We have the Kagyu school of Tibetan Buddhism. This is particularly coming through great Indian masters such as Tilopa and Naropa, bringing in through great Tibetan translator Marpa, whose greatest disciple and probably widely acknowledged as the greatest yogi in Tibet, Milarepa. So when this system of practice was brought in, we have Kagyu school being formed, and the framework or the system of practice that was introduced into Tibet is now commonly referred to as Mahamudra. So Mahamudra is a Sanskrit word. In both of these systems of practice, they put a lot of emphasis on the mind itself, focusing on the mind itself. And so often these styles of practice are called, both Dzogchen and Mahamudra, nature of the mind practices. And then we also have another school slowly being formed called the Sakya. And here, the system of practice that was introduced into Tibet from India in Tibetan is called Lam Dre. Lam means path, Dre means result. So it's talking about the paths and result. So again, it's another framework or system of practice to strive for the goal of enlightenment. And then lastly, we have the Geluk school. And the Geluk school, the system of practice in the Geluk school is called Lam Rim. Lam means again path, Rim means stages. So this is the stages of the path to enlightenment. And this framework or system of practice was brought into Tibet from India by a great Indian master, Lama Atisha, around the 10th century. And then slowly that system of practice developed in Tibet, and then it was really expanded upon in the 14th, 15th century by great Tibetan master Lama Tsongkhapa. And so now the Geluk school, Lama Tsongkhapa is said to be the founder of the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism. Dalai Lama himself belongs to the Geluk school, but he's said to be the spiritual head of all four schools. And so what we're going to be doing starting tomorrow is we're going to look at the Lam Rim framework, how the path to enlightenment is set up within the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism. But today we're going to first look at the foundation, the Four Noble Truths, and then have a look at how the various Theravada and Mahayana schools of Buddhism build on that. So provide a very general framework today, and then tomorrow we're going to launch into the Lam Rim framework. Any questions about any of that, the sort of the history part?
I didn't understand the Tibetan Buddhism, the four different schools. What's the connection to two different
Yeah.
Theravada
So when Buddhism first spread from India, it spread through the Pali language, and it spread to Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, the Southeast Asian countries. So all of those are based on the Pali texts, and collectively all of those traditions now are called Theravada traditions. Then as Buddhism continued to develop and evolve in India, it was started to be more transmitted through Sanskrit language. And then at that time, it spread through the northwest of India, over the Himalayas, onto the Silk Route, into China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and then also over the Himalayas into Tibet. So all of those traditions are based on the Sanskrit texts, and collectively they are all Mahayana traditions. So in the Mahayana traditions, the goal of spiritual practice is enlightenment, becoming Buddha. And so in there we have Zen, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, Tibetan, Mongolian. So all of those are Mahayana traditions. And so all of the 4 Tibetan schools, of course, are in the Mahayana. This, the first school that was formed, Nyingma school, literally means old or original. Then Buddhism was suppressed in Tibet for a few centuries, and then all of these schools started to evolve from the 10th, 11th century onwards. So collectively, these are often called the Sama schools. Sama is a Tibetan word, means new school. So Nyingma is the old school, and they're the new schools because they came later after Nyingma.
So can you explain again the difference between Nirvana and enlightenment?
That's to explain in detail requires other things, but the short answer now is that Nirvana, and I'll talk more in detail later, Nirvana is the goal of personal liberation from suffering. Enlightenment is actually a step further, and that is full awakening so that we can help to liberate everyone else from suffering. What the difference really is, what it really looks like, requires me talking about a few other things first. And I'll talk about that later this afternoon, the more detailed difference. But the short answer is, Nirvana is personal liberation, enlightenment is full awakening, and enlightenment is a further step. Any other questions? Okay, so that's a little bit of the history of Buddhism and how it spread, and the context for the Tibetan Buddhism and the Lam Rim. So now it's time for a morning tea break. So let's have a tea break and come back at 10:45.